Hello and welcome to the Global Conscious Parenting Assembly. I'm your host. My name is Karin Wachter, and I would like to open up honest conversation about parenting. My fantastic guest today is Darren Hall, and we will talk about the topic raising boys with conscious masculinity. Darren, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on this assembly. And before we talk about our topic today, tell us a little bit about you and your background. Where are you? Who are you? How it's been your journey through life that leads you to be sitting here just in front of me talking about parenting boys.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm coming to you right now from Greece. I'm currently on a bit of a Europe tour and adventure, a bit of a sabbatical too, working on my next book. So I'm also an author and a writer. And in this context, I've been working with men, running men's circles, running men's courses and retreats for over a decade. And that's been a real passion of mine, this whole paradigm of men's work and raising conscious masculinity in a world that has been, yeah, going through a lot of healing around things like toxic masculinity and dismantling patriarchy. And then I'm also known for a lot of my music. I'm a sound healing musician. I run trainings in sound healing. I'm a poet. I'm a writer, as I mentioned. And I'm also just a spiritual educator. I'm all about raising the consciousness of humanity and teaching a lot of ancient wisdom bridled to a lot of novel ideas of philosophy and science, actually.
Wow, that sounds amazing to me. Um,
True Gemini, jack of many trades.
Yes, but before we start, I just want to give our audience some data around our topics, namely raising boys nowadays. And these data about the boys is that in general, they are not doing very well in today's society, right? In contrast to girls who are doing much better. We as a society have managed to completely flip the gender gap in higher education within 40 years, actually, which is amazing. That means two-thirds of the top performers in high schools and universities are girls. And on the flip side, that means two-thirds of those on the bottom are boys, especially with regard to US and Canada. And there are also much more data. I just want to come up with some. Boys are nowadays three times as likely to be addicted, so three times more likely to be addicted, four times more likely to kill themselves, 12 times more likely to be incarcerated, four times more likely to be homeless. So that seems to suggest that the role of man has changed a lot
Mm-hmm.
and that we need conscious masculinity. And this expression, well, it might be new to people, or people might not know what it stands for. So let's start with the very obvious. What is conscious masculinity?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely integrating a psychological understanding, isn't it? And really, I've been a student of psychology, and one of the big inspirations for me is Dr. Gabor Mate, who you and your audience might be familiar with. I've actually had the amazing opportunity to befriend Dr. Mate. I've played my sound healing music for one of his workshops in Toronto, and I actually attended a 10-day retreat with him in Mexico years ago called the Wounded Healer Retreat, which was an integration of the plant medicine ayahuasca and shamanic ceremony with psychotherapeutic integrations. And, Gabor is definitely shining this light on how we are a deeply traumatized species. And what trauma really is it's going through pain and a lot of crisis moments, particularly when we're so young as children, that we don't have the ability to really integrate what is going on. And what happens on the level of the psyche is we fragment our personality, we hide away, we compartmentalize these experiences, which is actually a safety mechanism of our psyche, that we have this amazing ability to continue going on in life, having this kind of resilience, and we store these traumatic events somewhere else. And of course, they show up later in our adult life as what are called triggers, these episodes that some similar type of experience happens in our everyday life that has a resonance with this traumatic experience. And because it's so old from our childhood, it doesn't really show up as a clear, intelligible, like, this is from this. It's more like a very felt sense. The unconscious speaks more through feelings, through symbology. It's a very kind of primal, instinctual arena. And when it comes to men, because the male wound in our culture is still very much not talked about, it's not discussed. We're still trying to make space for men to share themselves emotionally. I mean, we've all heard this cliche thing that men have a problem sharing their feelings. But that's still very alive. And the statistics you have just mentioned really speak to that. And I do think it's wonderful just to speak to the things that you've shared, that I think there was a need to make space for women to come forward, to vault forward. And I've seen this in my own life. I just turned 45 this year, but when I first had my spiritual awakening in my early 20s, and spirituality in my mind is a pragmatic pathway of self-development, really at its authenticity. So when I started studying yoga, meditation, all these ancient arts and sciences, there was always women who were in the yoga classes, the grand majority of women who were doing the work. And I think that was because society shifted to finally give women a space to rise up, to have opportunities, to gain more independence. And they immediately sought to evolve themselves and to really positively transform. And we've created a lot of space with the Me Too movement that happened in 2016, I believe, where, you know, the voice of that collective pain body of the feminine through eons of abuse, sexual, physical abuse, was given voice. And that was an amazing moment. And I think it was actually a galvanizing moment for a lot of men to really hear the pain and the lament of all these women. It motivated some men to get their shit together. But I think since then, it's becoming very obvious that the pendulum's kind of swinging now towards the men, saying, hey, wait a second, do men have pain too that hasn't been really tapped? And with all these statistics that are coming forward, it's very clear, yes, there's a crisis amongst men. And for me, doing the men's work, and when I found the men's work, it was like a tonic to my soul when I started to study masculine archetypes, which is kind of my gateway in. And as I start to hold men's circles from my own just healing that I went through, I start to realize, wow, there's a big need for this. And when I start to hold men's circles, there are just so many men who want to come together to share. Just having a circle where we could share our feelings was such an immense thing to do. And this is helping then bring things into more of a conscious space, because if we can start to shine a light, because consciousness has always been synonymous with light, and unconscious is dark in a very simplistic way. So the more we start to shed a light on these wounds, on what is troubling men, we are shining that light into the shadows of the unconscious, and holding enough dynamic spaces that when that light goes into the shadow, there can be some terrifying things there. And we want to be able to have a group dynamic set up where we can support each other in uncovering those things. And it's, I'd say, doubly hard for men, because men from a very young age, since boyhood, are not really given the training, the understanding on how to be emotional, how to be in touch with their emotions. This whole cliche, boys don't cry, it's still very prevalent in our culture. There is a change happening, there's no doubt. The rise of men's work is becoming exponential. But to get men to share and to kind of understand what is going on, it's a very sensitive process. It can be. But I'm very warmed by the fact that there is a lot of men's work showing up in the world now.
Yeah, that speaks really to my heart, and I see that happen around me everywhere. So speak a little bit more about what is men's work and about the archetypes you mentioned. What archetypes do you refer to, and what is men's work, and how is it different from women's work?
That's a great question. Well, I always like to joke with the men that oftentimes we're doing this work to keep a pace with the women. Because as I mentioned, women in my mind have vaulted forward, and in a very necessary step. I mean, the patriarchy, having a very male-dominated culture, has not done us much good. If you look at the last 100 years, the amount of war that has happened on the planet, which is a very masculine trait to solve problems through brutal conflict. I mean, we've just desperately needed more women and feminine leadership, which tends to bring more of that intuitive, even motherly quality to things that's very prized, especially in traditional indigenous cultures where the grandmothers really hold some of the greatest power. Um, but for me, it's very interesting. When I first found men's work, it was back in 2012. I was in India. My father had just passed away, and losing my father was like losing an aspect of God. No one can prepare you for the loss of a parent, because this person has really been your creator in some ways. Not only just viscerally conceiving you as a being, but raised you and cultivated and had a huge influence on who you are. And I decided to take a pilgrimage to India and get away from it all and sort of be with the grief. And just, I'd always wanted to go to India. It was a longing for many years. And when I was in India, I met this amazing, beautiful male friend from Portugal, Duarte. And we were walking one day in the mountains of Kodaikanal in Tamil Nadu province. And he just had this smile on his face. And he said, "Hey, have you ever done any work on your masculinity?" And it was quite a question, because at that moment I realized, no, most of my work had been on developing my femininity. I had received all this reflection from society that men needed to get in touch with their feminine. They needed to become more sensitive, get in touch with their feelings. But I'd never seen it in the context of that being about masculinity. I'd actually seen masculinity as something problematic, something that I wanted to repress or keep away. And then he mentioned this book called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And he had said that this book had been given to him by female witches. And he meant this in praise, not in a derogatory term. Female witches, very empowered, wise women in Europe, had given him this book. And they had said, and this had always stuck with me, they said, every man needs this book because it's technology that will truly empower him. So I immediately bought the book upon returning to Canada, where I used to live and where I was born, in Toronto. And it was true to those words. The minute I started reading this book, it was like finding that one vitamin or mineral in your diet that you were deficient of. It was just this immediate tonifying, strengthening experience. And the archetypes, really what they are, it's pretty much innovated by Carl Jung. Although Carl Jung himself said that the archetypes go all the way back to the Middle Ages, even, or even further back, even to stone art. In some of the ancient stone paintings in places like France and all over the world, you find these images, these characters like kings, warriors, and queens. And what Jung brought forward was this more modern understanding that the archetypes are kind of how human consciousness can be categorized. I like to use the example of, if you have a quartz crystal and you shoot a laser through it, it will refract into all these like perfectly symmetrical colors of the rainbow. So if you think of consciousness, pure consciousness moves into the human soul, the psyche, and then it will spray out into these lines, these maps of lines of force, of character force. And of course, the Jung characterized these four major masculine archetypes: king, warrior, magician, lover. But some have said that there are more, the holy fool, for example. But the beautiful thing about these is that when you start to read about them and you start to activate them in your life, they are living lines of personality, of character within you. So the idea is, when you start to work with the archetypes, they start to activate inside of your being. Mm-hmm. And how the archetypes work is, it's the form of a triangle structure. So at the top, at the apex of the triangle, is when you're expressing the archetype in what Jung called the fullness, or its most excellent expression. So we could say, for example, with the king, the king is very much about ordering, about harmonizing the realm. So seeking harmony in your life. The king also understands has this power to radiate love and wisdom. So it blesses and appreciates other people's gifts, just like the king and queen used to hold the court, and the people of the land would come and they would acknowledge their gifts. And that would be an anointing, it would bestow this kind of confidence in people. But when you fall into the unconscious, the shadow, it's a bipolar mechanism of being too excessive or too deficient of that archetype's powers. So this is where we have the tyrant king. The king that is not comfortable with his power. So he's constantly trying to over control situations, assert himself, and is bipolar. So it's really founded on the other point, which is the weakling king. So the tyrant king typically has at his foundation a very weak king, and vice versa. Someone who's presenting more of the weakling king, kind of always shy, doesn't want to assert his power. At a certain point, if you push that person, they'll turn into this raging tyrant. So the idea is, we want to start to direct ourselves to these virtuous attributes. So it provides this map. You can start to read, okay, this is what I need more in my life. I need to be more order and harmony. And the shadow, yeah, wow, I over control things. I don't lead, I dominate situations. So it can be intense because you start to see, like, you take stock and inventory of your character.
Mhm.
Um, and then I developed a whole training and a program in this called Kings of the Heart, which is a 6 week online teaching program. I used to teach it in person, and I still do when I'm living in one place for quite a while because I'm quite nomadic. And it's very powerful to take men through this experience because it really brings a great consolidation of their strengths, and it helps them get a handle on where they are weak, and to know that they can improve and they can grow and they can transform.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by what you say, and I can imagine not only men, but even women get a sort of orientation in their life by just, well, dealing with these archetypes. Whatever you deal with and have you make an idea and you get an idea into your life. But I think it's very necessary to talk about that and to discuss that with other people, preferably, right?
Mhm.
To see where are you in your shadow or in your strength, and that can be very healing as well. So tell me more a little bit about your program, the King's program, what you do exactly.
Yeah, well, just to jump off what you said, there is also the feminine archetypes as well, and there are writers and philosophers out there who are doing a lot of great work in bringing that this archetypal science, the science of the soul, to women as well. But in my Kings of the Heart program, what it looks like is we do this 6 week journey that's kind of bookended by an opening session and a closing session. And the opening session is really just illuminating the terrain, much of the things that we've been talking about, looking at the crisis of masculinity, the need to move forward. And I also give a lot of space for each of the men to share specifically what are their grievances, what are their pain. And we try and hold a very compassionate space for that. But with men as well, men operate very much with the warrior. The warrior is it's probably the most intimate archetype for men, the most comfortable to get behind, because in patriarchal culture we see the warrior a lot in action movies and stuff like that, although it's usually in its shadow form. But I find that when the warrior comes online, and we work with the warrior archetype first, so we work through then 4 weeks with each archetype, and I give them assignments each week to then take into their life to embody that. And I've recorded a set of guided meditations that they listen to each morning to visualize this archetype being activated in their life. And every one of us has a unique expression of the archetype. And I learned this from working with an archetypal therapist in my own healing at some point, a beautiful English man called Rod Boothroyd, who also wrote a new kind of book updating the archetypal psychology information. And when you start to, bring forth your warrior, for instance, the idea is to let your psyche present this warrior to you. And it could be this figure, a samurai, it could be a Viking. And this is said to be a real life embodiment of your warrior. And they carry messages, and we have dialogues with these inner forces. It can get quite mystical and very profound. And returning to the warrior. So I find the warrior, when we start with the warrior, it's necessary because a lot of the masculinity men's work that is needed this day and age is a restoration of masculinity. What I had received previous to finding this work, as I mentioned, was this idea that there was something wrong with masculinity, that we needed less masculinity in the world. But through studying these books, working on these in my life, I've realized, as Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette, the writers of these books, do mention very boldly, they say the world actually needs more masculinity, but it needs more healthy masculinity. And when men start to empower themselves with forces like the warrior, which can be a scary prospect for men, because the warrior is about owning that men are born with, usually on average, more yang energy, as we call it in Chinese medicine, which I used to practice, which is this kind of aggressive force. And
Yes.
there's nothing wrong with aggression, particularly when we need to assert boundaries in our life. We need to be assertive. We need to be affirming of who we are.
Yeah.
And so when we move week by week, the warrior is always kind of alive in the work, because we want to also be accountable to each other. So we want to have this dynamic group where once we get the grievances out in the open, we want to set ourselves on a progression where we're going to actually start to heal, come into more wholeness. So I often give one step each week is, what step are you going to take in your life to really change? And it's just a small step. We're not looking for anything really big at the beginning. But then the next week we have a check-in, and it's not an accusatory check-in like, hey, did you do the work? You didn't do the work. What's wrong with you? It's more like an inquiry, as Gabor Mate would call it, a compassionate inquiry. So did everyone achieve the step that they want to do, which is what integrity is? You do what you say. And, we celebrate for those who have been victorious. And for those who haven't, we just open up an inquiry like, hey, what happened? What was the mechanism? Why did you fall? Can we support you? And then we go into that process. And this is really helpful for men because it gives them this sense that they have brothers around them. And they're not there to judge them or give them any kind of score. They're there to actually cheer them on and realizing that we're all going to fall. The path of transformation evolution is not an upward curve. It's always this wave. So we want to really encourage and be each other's cheerleaders. And that's, to me, the essence of the men's work is building brotherhood. When you have a band of brothers around you encouraging you, that's a powerful engine in your life.
And I think that's so needed because when I hear the term brotherhood, my first instinct goes to military, right?
Band of brothers.
The mirror, yeah. So exactly, band of brothers and something like that. But actually, bringing it back to masculinity would be so helpful. And I think you are so right and also spot on that men and women are different, even if so many people don't want to see that. Yes, they're in so many aspects, they are alike, but they're slightly different as well when it comes maybe to crying or sex drive or risk taking or competitiveness, right? We are different, and we should, as you said, we should really revere it and develop it in ourselves and let it grow in a healthy way. And I can imagine that when you do men's work, it's more or less adult men, right?
More or less. I have had younger men take my programs,
Mm,
like late teens.
yeah.
Um, but yes, mostly in that context. But a lot of them are fathers too.
Okay.
So
Good.
there is a kind of outreach to the male children, their sons and their family. I have not really specialized in working with boys,
Yeah.
but I do have a lot to share on the subject. And I think this is where the work is going to go more and more because right now, as all these men are getting rectified and aligned, there's going to be a necessary, and I'm already seeing it with things like the Sacred Sons group. I know another men's group that started back in Canada, and they've started running vision quest initiations, which is a huge process that men have lost in modernity, the initiation ceremony,
Yes.
which is to bring boys into manhood. But there is a huge crisis among children and boys for sure, especially with the amount of technology. I think
Yeah.
in one of our initial conversations, I shared about pornography addiction, which is something that I've struggled with and something that I teach about and that I talk about a lot, especially in our day and age where you
Let's
have,
still,
yeah,
let's still stick a little bit with the initiation ceremonies. So,
sure.
mm, there is definitely a loss. These ceremonies are still going on, probably in South Africa or some remote areas in Africa. But we in Europe, in North America, we lost those ceremonies. How can we revive it? Is it necessary, in your understanding, to revive something like that?
Well, the beautiful thing that Young and I think Joseph Campbell also spoke. Maybe it was more Joseph Campbell who spoke to this, who's of course the great creative mythologist, helped us understand all these universal stories that are weaving
Yeah.
ancient culture together. That life is an initiation. There is something about this divine universe that we live in that when you really start to reflect upon the trials and tribulations of your life, when you call forth prayer and they're answered, you start to realize that we're interacting with some kind of giant divine mind that we're a part of that places synchronicities, meaningful coincidences on our path. And so, even though we've lost this incredible ancient technology of demarking that there's a stage during puberty where boys have to be put onto a track
Yeah.
towards masculinity, where you have to leave that kind of innocent Garden of Eden and start to take the responsibility of becoming more of a participant in the social order, which can be, quite an intense but also beautiful, heroic challenge.
Yeah.
That life itself will always be presenting challenges to us,
Mhm.
and it's about contextualizing our life to see that we are in this mythological journey of heroically evolving ourselves, transforming. And so when people start to reframe their life, and this is why I've been such a student of mythology, because I get so inspired by learning, okay, I'm part of this generational thread of men and women, this human species, and studying all the different religions and spirituality and history itself, you start to realize that the malaise of modernity, which is a mythless world. Jung spoke about this. He said one of the tragedies of the modern world is it's mythless. We don't have these guiding stories anymore. Like I grew up in Canada, it was like hockey, drinking Tim Hortons coffee, all these kind of empty meanings that don't inspire someone to really take a hold of their life and do something passionate with it. It's more about just being like this citizen and consumer. And you vote for every 4 years, which is kind of a lackadaisical way of being participant in democracy. But that being said, there are also organizations that are trying to bring back some form of initiation rites. I myself was blessed to go and experience an actual initiation ceremony with First Nations or Indigenous people in Canada, which is also called Turtle Island, through this elder called Dave Cushing, and he was Anishinaabe, which is a tribe of these First Nations peoples that live. Well, he lived in Manitoba and had this beautiful eco-spiritual school restoring Indigenous wisdom called the Turtle Lodge. And in 2012, which again, powerful year, India, my father had just passed away. That summer, I traveled to Manitoba and participated in their Vision Quest, which is 3 days out in the land, no food, no water, just you and Mother Earth, really. And it's a very challenging experience. And the idea is that you need a challenging experience. And men and women are both doing Vision Quest now. I know of different circuits of shamanic schools that are doing this, but I will say there's something about men that more or less needs a deeper initiation, because women with their moon cycle, with their menses, their nature is just going to initiate them regardless. They're going to go through this experience once a month where they lose 80% of their energy, and they are cleaning their blood, which is their soul. They're cleaning the world's soul. Women will be initiated. And I think that's why women have largely been, have roles as wisdom teachers and wisdom keepers in a lot of ancient traditional societies, because they have this very powerful track. Men have to kind of work for it. And so initiation ceremonies were more geared towards men, because it was realized that there was something that had to be sort of initiated, commenced, catalyzed in a man's life, because nature wasn't necessarily going to do it for him as it was for women. And so there is these new initiation rites happening. And I do recommend for people to just, go on searches on the internet and look up men's work. There's projects like Mankind Project, the Sacred Sons are two big global organizations now. But there's a lot of local men who are holding men's circles and now are realizing, okay, we've been doing this for a number of years. The next step would be restoring these rights, so that we can fulfill this emptiness that a lot of us have struggled through, so that we can make sure that the younger ones realize that this is a very powerful moment in their life. And there is some precision that has to take place in that moment.
Yeah, I hear you. And nevertheless, I see, well, lots of men and women, replacing real life experiences with algorithms and screens. And this is two things that don't go with each other. Well, talk about this. You already started to talk about pornography a little bit. Why is pornography addiction becoming such an epidemic, and how can we help boys navigate it toward a healthier, also sexuality? It's so unhealthy for them and for the women, and it's damaging them deeply.
Yeah, to me, this is one of the great pandemics that is happening in the world. When you go into the stats about pornography addiction, because the studies are just starting to come now, because the internet's only been around for about 20 or so or 30 years. So, when it comes to psychological studies, you need a very long duration of time to see, the stages of reaction and development and that can happen in a person's life. And what we're starting to see now with some of these studies coming back is that with the hypersexualization that the internet gives us, it's causing a massive erosion of the healthy function of sexuality in largely men. Women also look at pornography, but the rates are way more higher in men because men have a much more stimulated visual cortex.
Yeah.
So when it comes to sex, that visual cortex is much more prone to being sensitive, to being hungry for being fed. And we need to understand what is happening on the level of the brain when it comes to pornography. And what it's doing is it's really regressing and retarding the dopamine cycle in the brain. So the dopamine cycle is this hormone of reward circuitry. So in life, when you have a reward, when you have some good food or drink a nice drink, you get a little spike of dopamine. But we've now discovered that when men and women, for that matter, when they have an orgasm, the dopamine actually fires in the brain. So the orgasm is also a brain experience.
Mhm.
And when this dopamine explodes in the brain, it can take about 2 weeks for it to come back into equilibrium.
Wow.
And the signs of dopamine deficiency are that all those little things in life that were so rewarding and satisfying previous no longer give you that spike anymore.
Yeah.
So this is why, the next day lovers can all of a sudden feel this strange discontent, like we were just in this beautiful bond of love the night before, and this morning it's kind of like there's a malaise. And one of the only things that spikes the dopamine back up, and only temporarily to its previous like moderate levels, is novelty. So this is what explains the pornography kind of spiral into the dark, is that a man will start, looking at porn. And then we also have to understand ejaculation. This is something that the Taoists, the ancient Chinese mystics, the Tantrikas, um, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but really the cure for this is education around sacred sexuality, realizing that our ancient ancestors had a lot to say about sexuality, and most of us are given 0 to 0 education about sex, which is one of the most powerful forces in your body. It's highly connected to your creativity, highly connected to how you feel as an individual, and then you're just thrown into society with all this manipulative programming around you, pop culture, which is so hypersexualized. So
Yes.
it creates this double-edged sword where you're given no education on how to control this energy. And then you're thrown into an environment where, especially for men with that visual cortex, there's just so much hyperstimulation. So what they're starting to see is that the trend of pornography addiction that used to happen was that you'd go to like magazines like Playboy, or you'd find like an X-rated movie or something like that. It was a little harder. There was like kind of like, and it was kind of like a quest. Like I remember being a teenager and like
Exactly.
you'd be looking for this chalice of a Playboy magazine.
Yes.
But now all you have to do is go on to the internet, and you can have a harem of 20 tabs open of 20 different women.
Yeah.
And that is just way too much for the human nervous system. It's
Yeah.
just absolutely desensitizing the
Yeah.
nervous system. And then what they're seeing in these studies, these long-term studies, is that there's a lot of erosion of the frontal lobe of the brain, which controls your sense of control, of discipline, of willpower. And it's very similar. It's like the same brain as a heroin addict or a
Yeah.
cocaine addict.
Yeah.
And that is a massive problem. And what's happening now is you're having this happening at a younger age where the brain hasn't fully developed yet.
Mhm.
This is a really tragic thing. So you're having like 10, 12-year-old boys who are getting into
Exactly.
porn addiction at an age where their brain isn't even fully formed. And that can create a lot of intense repair work that is needed. But the last thing I'll say here is that the repair work, the resiliency of nature, everything can be healed, can be brought to whole again. Nature is so regenerative, so resilient. And really, it begins by then giving education. So, something I'm very passionate about is one of my things in life that I'd love to do is start bringing sacred sexuality into the high schools, start teaching the young people about these things,
Yeah.
to
That
start to make them realize there's a beautiful tradition here.
Yeah, I was about to ask if you are also going to schools, because I see in my school where I work, they have a subject called ethics where they talk about all those things, but it's not really an antidote for that. So I think to bring on someone like you into the classroom speaking about this topic would be more helpful. So that would be one antidote that I see. Do you see other antidotes in educating young people?
Well, I would just put it out if there's anyone in your audience who's filmmakers,
Mm.
musicians, writers, we need art that really portrays beautiful partnerships, beautiful lovemaking, the romanticism ethic. I mean, one of my favorite writers, who's a teacher of mine, John Lam Lash, he's kind of like Joseph Campbell. He's gone very deep into the Gnostic mystery schools, the ancient European indigenous traditions, and he talks a lot about how in the Middle Ages, with the rise of the troubadours and in
Mhm.
the Romantic eras, that romanticism is not just this, like, think of these rom-com movies, these romantic Hollywood movies. Romanticism is a deep tradition of chivalry.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
realizing how to cultivate bonds of monogamy and make them long lasting for a lifetime. And that entails a multidimensional discipline of having, firstly, a lot of control over one's sexuality. And control isn't a bad thing. I love that the Taoists called it angelic control. Because
Wow.
when you just start to work with your anatomy, as simple as this, one of the most simple things you can do in sacred sexuality is breathe the energy from your aroused genitals up into your heart and your body. There are inner energetic channels that circulate these subtle life force energies, and largely sex is seen as this kind of genital act. But when you learn to breathe that energy up, it will naturally start to circulate throughout your whole body. Sexual energy is profoundly healing for the body. And I myself, my first book that I've written, Love's Revolution, it's a book all about sacred sexuality,
Mhm.
poems, essays, and short stories. Um, I even have the two short stories that book ended are about reframing some of the Western mythological stories, like the rise of Eve is the first story. So we talk about the Garden of Eden as actually this different mythology about the empowerment of women, because of course the serpent in a lot of the mystery schools was a sign of the goddess of wisdom. It wasn't this criminal that was trying to tempt Adam and Eve into falling. And of course Adam and Eve, when they fell, the first thing they did was cover their genitals. So you start, the sexual wound goes so far back. And
Yeah.
then I end the book with a discussion about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, because this is a huge captivation among the new age and spiritual communities now. Did Jesus have a lover or a wife even? Was Mary Magdalene this beautiful feminine counterpart, which humanizes Jesus, which gives this whole idea of Christ a whole new spin? Was Christ, in fact, an energy that both of these beings possess? Maybe it was something that was regenerated through their union, because you see with sacred sexuality, you can heal all manner of wounds, addictions, because this energy is so profoundly healing when it's really taught how to grow it, generate it, and circulate it in the body.
Yeah, not for nothing. We have taken out the word sacred there and healing there. It's just a consumerism mechanism we made out of it nowadays in our society. And it, as you said, it needs lots of healing and lots of education, especially for young people. And I feel for them. It's so difficult nowadays with the dating market to find your way around and to find a safe way to yeah, experiment and get your own experiences as a young adult. It's not easy. It's for I feel nowadays it's much more difficult than when I was young. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have to restore this sense of union.
Yes.
Chivalry is a
Sacred union.
beautiful, yeah, and chivalry, especially for boys and men, when you start to realize, and I read about this a lot in my book, how, when a man learns to really love a woman, to really sexually satisfy her, to really support her. And the moon cycle that women go through in a lot of the ancient cultures, young men would be taught about the moon cycle, how every week the woman is literally traveling through a different archetype.
Yes.
And they can help her go through these experiences. She becomes much more intuitive, kind of like an oracle as well. She can help him, realizing that men and women have this higher dynamic of partnership where they can actually accelerate each other's growth, where they can be each other's cheerleaders, each other's supports. And then of course, if they choose to have children, they can see themselves in this higher context of like continuing the generation of this blessed divine species that we're a part of. And I think when you talk to young men, I think every young man who's heterosexually speaking in this context, of course, they love and adore women at their essence. Now, that may be obscured, but when you really get down to it, the reason pornography addiction is such a problem, and I have an essay in my book called Pornography Addiction is Misplaced Devotion,
Mhm.
because it's not about shaming men. If you have, 20 tabs open on your computer, you're in a place of worship in a way. You're so activated by the beauty of women, by their sensuality, by their sexuality. And if you clarify that desire, because it's been taught, it's been twisted, it's been distorted, but you get to the essence, you want to make love to a woman. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the most beautiful experience you may have. And outside of sex, when you actually come into partnership and you realize that you can help each other grow with proper communication, this paradigm called conscious partnership brought forth by things people like John Welwood, this American Buddhist psychologist. I mean, these are beautiful pathways. And I
Mhm.
have a feeling that if young people are given the right means, and the series of books I'm writing now is fiction. I'm writing a trilogy of books called Earth Night, and it's all about a young man being initiated by this older man into a lot of these things that we're talking about. And one of the big heroic dynamics in the book is he falls in love with this woman, and he wants to he's himself healing from pornography addiction, and he wants to restore this sense of chivalry, of earning the love of a woman, even.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so there's so much work to be done, which is at one hand like, oh my gosh, but then it's also so exciting with all
Yeah.
the possibilities.
Yeah, we just need, we have so much knowledge and wisdom in place and accessible to us. We never had such an access to so much knowledge that it's the only thing is we have to canalize that in a healthy way for us, right? And make it accessible for us. But I don't want to finish our conversation about sexuality, a sacred union. I would like to finish with just ordinary challenges boys have. Oftentimes the message to boys, especially also in my school, I'm working at an international school in the middle of Berlin. You should be more like your sister, maybe as if they were a malfunctioning girl, so you're not feminine enough, you're not caring enough, you're not nurturing enough, or don't cry enough, so not vulnerable enough. So, but what are the typical challenges boys face in our present age that may challenge their transition into this noble manhood? Is there something we have forgotten maybe here in our conversation that needs to be mentioned?
Well, I think probably the thing that a lot of boys are struggling with the most is having appropriate role models.
Yeah,
So, for all the men out there, this is a great calling for men to realize that the younger generations need our support.
yeah,
And it's also about being intentional with what they are consuming in terms of culture. So when I was young, I was lucky to have the Star Wars saga, the original Star Wars saga. The new Star Wars sagas, to me, are a little weak on the mythological understanding, but the original ones, and there's all manner of beautiful movies, especially back in the day. Nowadays, movies have become just too much about entertainment.
yeah.
But I think of one of my favorite films is Gandhi, the beautiful biography of this man. Putting these beautiful forms of art and education in front of boys, I think will be inspiring to them, especially of beautiful men who have led very heroic and virtuous lives.
Mhm.
I think also realizing that, boys are very sensitive. I'm starting to actually realize in my work with men and women that men actually may even be more sensitive than women. And that's not a slight against women. I think it's just more or less because women go through this initiation, like with the menses,
Yeah.
they get kind of battle tested more with life. And then because boys are sort of not really welcomed into more of their feminine side in a healthy, integrated way, yeah, they tend to be a little more callous, a little more harder, rigid with their feelings,
Mhm.
and they really need to be, loved and honored. And then also just looking at, the archetypes, those can be really excellent ways to help boys map out their lives, I think, and again, just what I mentioned, like some of these movies are very archetypal. Lord of the Rings, for example, very profound archetypes, kings, warriors, magicians. Um, and then I think the last thing I'll share is that I think we all as a species need to realize that the technology that we're interfacing with is growing way too fast for our nervous systems to catch up to it. And we need to realize that the opposite, I would say, of screen time is nature time. So we need to take boys and girls out into nature more often. Boys should be learning survival skills. I mean, my great great uncle started the Boy Scouts, Ernest Thompson Seton. And the reason he started the Boy Scouts is because he said when modernity was moving us out of the villages into cities, into these industrial cities, he said he was seeing a scarcity or a poverty of the soul in men, particularly. There was something about the wild, about being in nature that galvanized something in a man's soul, in a boy's soul. But that goes for girls as well. Just spending time in nature is so healing. The beauty, the vastness, hiking. You know, I was just in Scotland for a month and just that land just healed so much in me, just being in these great mountains in the highlands. Um, so we need to realize that there is an agenda at play with social media as well. You know, the corporations, they're losing power right now. They want to keep us all kind of marketable and keep us hooked in. And the youth have always been the focus, pop culture. I find when I get older, I'm like, oh, they don't care about me as much anymore. There's so much energy given to capturing the attention of the youth. And I think it's getting younger and younger. And we need to be aware of that. We need to realize that the morals and the values that are coming through pop culture sometimes are a bit questionable.
I love the antidote of the screens is nature, and I can't agree more that, well, nature is healing, and we need to send the boys out in nature, out into sports field, and doing something in their way of they are meant to do, right? And I wanted to say something, it's slipped away. But okay, nature is a very nice final word for this conversation. I love your work, Darren. Thank you very much for everything you shared today with us. Very inspiring for parents and healing for parents as well to hear that there are means and tools and instruments we can use to save our boys. And I totally agree with you. So I experience boys very, very often uh, in their softness, and they are so sensible. Not for nothing, they mature later because they need more time to do that. And I feel for boys. I have a heart for boys. So yeah,
That's
let's
beautiful.
let's save them and let's push them out into nature to to heal themselves. Darren, where can people find you, and would you like to share some upcoming events or programs with our audience?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm in a lot of different places. One of the places that I'm most engaged with is Instagram, for better or for worse. I go by Darren Austin Hall there, and my music is also all over Spotify and iTunes. Also, Darren Austin Hall. My book, Love's Revolution, is available on Amazon. You can find it there. I do run a lot of online courses. As I mentioned, the Kings of the Heart. I'll be running this fall my Sacred Sexual Bliss course. It's a 4-week course that initiates people into sacred sexuality. And
Mhm.
I also have my Source Resonance Sound Healing Training Intensive Retreat that I run in Costa Rica every February, which will be happening next year, earlier in the year. And the last thing I'll share is this fall, I'll be launching my online school, Guy Awakening Wisdom School, where I'm putting a lot of my programming in one place. So it's easier to sort of engage with my work. And I'm very, very excited to be launching that. So look out for that. And I have a newsletter called The Druid that I send out twice a month as well, if you want to keep updated on all my information.
Thank you for sharing all your wisdom. I wish you all the best for the future, Darren. So thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in conscious parenting, Karin.
Thank you very much.